If you or someone you know has a story, encounter, or experience you would like to share with my viewers, please send it to my email at stories@whatlurksbeneath.com. Thank you. Was working at my construction site late into the night, getting some tools out of my truck when the most horrific roar came from the woods surrounding the site. A few of us on the night crew stopped, looked around, and then at each other and shrugged. We were spooked, but we had a job to do. We weren't going to let some silly noises stop us. We continued doing our night crew work, and things went as normal for the next few hours. We actually forgot about the roar until we heard some banging and clanging out by our work trucks. Since I was the supervisor on shift, I thought a couple things. One of our crew members was banging around, destroying things, or could have needed help. Or two, somebody was trying to steal our shit. I paced on over to where my work truck is, and as I'm about 20 feet away from my truck, out pops this horrible looking face from behind the bed of the truck. I stopped in my tracks. This shape stood up to tower over the bed of the truck. It looked down into the bed and reached to pick up what looked to be a dead animal from the bed of the truck. If I had to guess, maybe a small deer, and then looked right back at me, turned around and walked off into the night. Had I just seen a werewolf in the living flesh? Those teeth and that face. I was stunned for a few moments, not sure what the hell just happened. I felt like I was living in a dream in that very moment. These kinds of things don't exist in reality. So what the hell did I just see? Its teeth really stuck out to me, no pun intended. It bothered me. Nothing should have that many teeth. It was like looking into the mouth of a shark. So many teeth, all razor bladed. I knew those teeth were meant to shred meat to pieces. After a moment, I slowly walked back to my workers where they were laughing at me, joking what all that banging was. I was pale as a ghost, and apparently because they were asking me why I was so white. Did I see a ghost? Did I get scared of working out at nighttime? I just ignored it and just told them to keep working and drop it. Since we were doing the night crew thing that night, we left when the morning crew arrived later that morning as the sun rose. As I made my way back to my truck to leave, there was light, so things were a little more visible. There were blood splatters all along the side of the back of my truck. That's when I finally put the pieces together and realized that whatever was standing behind my truck was banging the small dead deer it had against my truck. That's what the banging was. I don't know if it was doing that to kill the small deer or if it was doing it to get somebody's attention to draw them over to my truck for an ambush. Whatever it was gave me instant chills as I had memories, vivid memories of those damn teeth again and that thing that stood up behind my truck. I didn't want to think about it anymore. I just got in my truck, ignoring it, and got home and sprayed all the blood off with my hose. That particular job site I got called into to cover a supervisor who had been out scared the living hell out of me and scared me so bad I have had second thoughts about returning as a night shift supervisor. My wife and I used to live in southern Ohio for quite some time. My wife worked as a nurse and would be pulling all sorts of random shifts. Sometimes her schedule would call her to work from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m., while other times she would work from 10 p.m. to 4 a.m. It was so sporadic and it really wore her down the few years she worked at that hospital. For those in question, they were extremely short-staffed during this time period, and she was willing to give her soul to her job, having just got out of med school and having need to build her career. I would try and call her on her breaks through the hospital line and check up on her. This was back in the early 90s, so we didn't have cell phones or anything like that. Everything was landlines. One night, she was returning home in the early morning hours. I can't give you an exact time because I believe my wife doesn't exactly remember. She knows it was after midnight, but before sunrise. She was driving back home when having to make a sharp bend in the road before pulling into another road that leads down to our house. As she made the sharp bend in the road, her headlight shone her something straight from the pits of hell. Crouching about 50 feet away from the road was this large, dark, brown shape that had a wolf-like appearance, but had a human-like physique. She said when her headlights hit this thing, it gave no eyeshine. Instead, she told me that this thing had coal-black eyes, and it was like they absorbed the light of the headlights of the car. Everything else lit up. Even the fur glistened in the shine of the light, but the eyes were a solid black. She was in hysterics, and stayed that way until she pulled up into the house, and ran in the house in a fray. It really terrified her seeing what she did that night. I knew for years afterward she had nightmares about that wolf face with the black eyes, haunting her in her sleep. Terrified it would find her and come after her. We moved about 4 years later, but she never ended up seeing that same creature that night. I really have no choice but to believe her. I mean, my wife is a very on-point individual. She wouldn't just make up something like that. It still haunts me how she came in the house, trembling with fear and weeping. For a while, she wanted to see a psychiatrist about hallucinating, but she said it was real, and she just didn't make it up. She had been working all sorts of shifts for a long time, and possibly chalked it up to exhaustion, but even then, nothing. No matter what time of night or day she came home, she never saw it again. This was the first and last time she saw what she did. I enjoy hunting throughout the U.S.A. State Forest, located in Pennsylvania. There's many of us around here that enjoy a good bow hunt, and I am no exception. To give you a better layout of the state forest, this area is a higher elevated forest, full of white pine and oak trees all throughout with thicker flowers and brush. This was in 2003, and I've had several friends who've been hunting in and around this area for years. I've gotten warnings that because of the lush population of deer, there's a high amount of Bigfoot activity in certain areas. I was a Bigfoot believer before this happened to me, but I had no idea these wolf creatures existed. I didn't even think it was a possibility. I've gone hunting in this forest a few years prior to this event and never had anything strange occur, so I was confident and ready to get myself a nice trophy buck this year. I got up in the wee early hours before sunrise and made it out there with my bow. I remember the air being crisp and cool. The onset of fall was really setting in this particular year. I remember walking quite a ways and making it to one of my stands that I had set up in the area. This particular one I had perched quite high up in the tree, more so than normal. I climbed up and climbed in, pulled out my coffee flask and sat and waited. I don't know at what point that I noticed the silence, but I became aware after some time the woods had died. Nothing. You could hear a pin drop from a mile away. It felt eerie. I've been doing this for a while, and I've never had my skin crawl like it did in that moment. From what I would estimate to be about 300 plus yards away in the woods was a bunch of whimpering and howling. This was loud. It sounded distorted, not like you would expect if you heard a coyote or a wolf, both of which I've heard, and it didn't quite match these sounds. I was curious, and so I kept trying to look around for any movement or anything that I could possibly see. Still, nothing. The whimpering and howling had stopped, and I began to hear movement in the brush from a little ways away, coming in my direction. Light was just starting to break, and I could start to make out minimal details around me. Things were still dead silent other than this movement that began sounding closer and closer. It sounded heavy, and I wasn't sure if it was a deer coming my way or what, but I could make out that there were multiple of whatever animal was approaching my direction. I heard branches breaking to my left, and out stepped these three beings. Beings is what I'll call them because it wasn't an animal, and it for certain wasn't a human. These three beings walked in unison together on 2 feet, very tall. If I had to guess, well over 6 feet, Their fur was charcoal black and looked to be like they absorbed all the light in the area. Their eyes, all three of them, had this horrible yellow glow to them as they slowly hunched over and walked slowly through the forest below, taking their time with each stride. I tried to stay quiet and not make a sound as I went into full-on panic mode. These monsters, whatever they were, gave off an incredibly evil vibe. If they wanted to climb up into my stand and devour me alive, they could have easily. I held my breath, trying not to make a sound. Every step these things took, you could feel it in the ground below. I could tell these creatures weighed a great deal of weight. It didn't surprise me with how much mass they carried around and how tall they were. One of them stopped only feet away from my stand. This thing started lifting up its head and sniffing the air. It sounded loud, like a big bear sniffing right outside somebody's tent. I pissed all over myself. I was so scared. I'm watching all of this transpire before my eyes. I'm very fortunate that my deer stand was up quite a ways in this tree, because had I been lower, it could have just reached up and pulled me out. This thing sniffed the air for a moment and did some sort of weird thing with its mouth. I can't even begin to describe the noise. It was like a clicking noise mixed with a guttural sigh. I don't know how to portray it accurately. It was communicating with the other two. The other two both stopped and looked up in my direction. I felt like I was going to have a heart attack in that moment. I don't think these things saw me, but they looked right up in my stand. One of those things must have signaled for the other two that there was a person up in that stand. I held onto my combat knife like it was my life, and I usually keep it strapped to my thigh, just praying my death would be swift and painless. But they just stood there, all three of them making these clicking, chattering, guttural noises for a moment, and then continued on westward. Once they were out of sight, I began crying. I was petrified. I had a hard time even convincing myself to move my body, and I needed to leave before those things got back. If I was caught on foot, I was for sure a dead man. I wasn't going to have that. I managed to work my body enough to climb down my stand, and I ran as fast as I could back to where I came and left. I should probably give a little more clarity on what I saw and how exactly long that it lasted. Because of the early morning hours with the sun just starting to break through, lighting conditions were poor at best. So a lot of what I saw were massive shapes and silhouettes, and those damn glowing yellow eyes. The shape was a massive body with a dog-like head and pointed ears on top. Reminded me of a wolf or a German shepherd face. I could make out a snout, but more specific details were hard to accurately point out. I watched the entire thing out of my peephole in the stand. As this thing stood below my stand, it did stick its snout up in the air to smell, and I think it smelt me, and then tried to communicate to the others that I was there. Their chattering sounded as if they were arguing amongst themselves, but again, it was very brief. They kept the same pace and stride all the way to where they were no longer visible. The entire occurrence probably only lasted 3 to 5 minutes at most, but in the moment, it felt endless. It felt as if time itself had come to an utter stop. I didn't think I was going to make it out alive. That experience alone really ruined the outdoors and hunting for me for quite a while. I had a hard time returning to what I was passionate about, and it took a whole 6 years till I could muster the courage to approach the woods again to hunt. The first few times back, I didn't go alone either. I wasn't risking something like that happening again. I never did go back to the national forest and instead hunted with friends on other land or their own properties. I told some of my hunting buddies about what I went through. These same buddies who have had hairy run-ins with Bigfoot himself, and they were in disbelief at a pack of whatever I ran into was out there in the woods. I was asked if I think what I encountered was a family of Bigfoots, but it didn't behave the way you hear Bigfoots behaving. I don't think Bigfoots have snouts either, and don't have ears on the tops of their heads. The way these animals hunched over as if their front arms were longer than their back legs. I've never seen a squatch in my day, but My buddies who have had plenty of run-ins with them have told me a lot about them. I got a feeling that this was a family or group of whatever these were. I'm just glad I was able to survive and tell you my story. Boy, do I have a hell of a tale for you, what lurks beneath. I've never written this to somebody before, and I'm hoping you'll be receptive to my experience. I remember it vividly, clear as day, every detail, and so I'm going to lay it out for you, the nitty-gritty. 10 years ago, I had just turned 21. Well, almost. It would have been August of 2009. To celebrate, me and 3 friends of mine drove all the way out to U.S.A. National Forest and northern Michigan. We drove from Washington State. We wanted to make a road trip out of it with my buddy Nathan, who was with me. He had family up in northern Michigan. Our plan was to stop and see his family briefly, and then go party. I was also with my other buddy CJ and his girlfriend Ashley. We had packed everything up on a Friday and left for northern Michigan. We spent about 3 days in total to reach our destination at Nathan's aunt's and uncle's house. Between all the frequent food stops and bathroom breaks, we were pretty antsy from being in a car for so long and just wanted to get out and go celebrate. We had come to party, and that's exactly what we were set out to do. Before we left his family's house, we loaded up on some Jack Daniels and beer. I have had an interesting past with old Jack. Our plan was to head north, deep into the Hiawatha National Forest, and find a good spot just to hike miles in and set up camp. Or so that was the plan. We drove up quite a ways. If I remember accurately, we passed Mapleville, which is way up there in Wisconsin. If you head east of Highway 41, you'll reach this lone road called NF13 with deep woods on both sides of the road. This was where we were going to venture off and begin our celebration. Along NF13, there are several different pullouts. Well, I'm going to call them pullouts for this story, because they're not necessarily roads either. They're more like pathways with only vehicle marks on the ground to indicate that you can drive down there. We suspected there to be campers or whatnot in them since they were just unmarked, and we didn't want to invade anyone's privacy. So, we just pulled our car off to the right of the road and got all of our stuff out and ready to go. We got all of our backpacks on, and the camping equipment and beer, and we were going to head out with handfuls of stuff. There's no marked camping spots or campgrounds where we were headed. I was aware that there was a campground within 20 miles of us. I'm not sure whether south or north, but we wanted to just go and explore the woods, be more secluded. I knew there was a stream west of NF13, so we headed in that direction. We probably spent 2 or so hours pushing onward west through the thick woods. We had our backpacks, tents, and cases of beer. It took us hours with all the breaks we had to take to get and find the perfect spot. But once we found it, that was it. We quickly set up our camp and started blasting music through our iPod. We had brought little speakers that were battery powered that we started blaring Lil Wayne through. We were cracking beers and drinking Jack and going crazy. At this time, I don't know the exact time, but the sun was starting to set. It was in August, so I don't know, maybe 7? Either way, we had a ton of beer. I shotgunned so much beer that I vomited at one point. Ashley and CJ were having a great time, but sought to retreat to their tent multiple times for 15 minutes because they needed to talk in private. We all knew what they were doing, and they were pretty vocal about that. Well, Ashley was, at least. Anyway, that would just leave me and Nathan to pound more beers. This repeated until about 11 p.m. I remember that because I had left my phone in my backpack all day and wanted to see if I had any service at all and pulled it out. I didn't have service, but it was 11:02. I felt fairly drunk, but was not shit-faced. Nathan was so drunk, and I think CJ and Ashley were either having pillow talk, or they had passed out at this point. So much for staying up late on my 21st, I thought. Nathan and I thought we would start to tone it down and just sat by the fire we made and bullshitted for maybe another hour or two before it was time to settle into our tent. Oh, I should expand on that. We brought 2 tents in total, one for me and Nathan to share and one for CJ and Ashley that they shared. They were across from one another with the fire in between us. Once in our tent, it didn't take us long to settle in our sleeping bags with a hearty, "Night, bro." And in my half-drunken stupor, I passed out. Next thing I know, I'm being shaken awake by Nathan. "Wake up! Wake up!" It took me a couple of seconds to come to, but now I'm pissed he's woken me up, so I snapped at him. He grabs me and says he thinks there's a bear outside of our tent. I shut up and I quietly listen intently, just like he is. Interestingly, the first thing I heard or didn't hear was the sound of the forest. It was August and the forest was alive and full of bugs and crickets all night during our drinking binge. Now it had fallen silent. I didn't hear a single sound. That was off. Then I started to hear heavy thuds, like from a heavy animal. Then I really started thinking there was a bear walking around our tent. It sounded big and I could tell it was close. Me and Nathan looked at each other and held our breath. We heard this thing get close to our tent and start sniffing. I really began to freak out, trying my best not to scream. I was terrified of bears, and I knew absolutely nothing about the temperament of bears, other than the fact that they can eat you. The sniffing continued, and then this animal seemed to totter off away from our tent. It started to huff and grunt like bears do. We heard it start to leave our tent, and could hear it still making noises. The noises began to trail off further and further. It started to get quiet, and I remember telling Nathan that we can relax. The bear was just strolling through, and now it's gone. As soon as I finished that sentence, I hear this crazy animal squeal and roar like I had never heard in my life. Nathan and I's attention snapped over to the side of the tent, freaking out. We started hearing a bunch of roaring, growling, and commotion going on. It was hard to tell how far away it was. It was in the middle of the night and it was pitch black outside. It couldn't have been too far away. We knew it was somewhat close by. The roaring ceased after maybe 30 seconds. I could not exactly tell what the fuck we just heard. It sounded like a bear fighting off a dinosaur. It was the most frightening thing to listen to in the middle of the night in the pitch black darkness. Nathan and I are basically shitting bricks at this point, shaking when we hear CJ scream out in the distance. He sounded far away, but it was undeniably his voice. Nathan and I shot each other a panicked look, and I quickly and slowly and as quiet as I could unzipped the tent, just enough that I could see his and CJ's tent. The door flap was open. I turned back to Nathan and told him it was CJ. I slightly stuck my head out of the tent and yelled, but whispered at the same time, "Ashley, are you in there?" I heard her softly sobbing in the tent. She whispered up telling me she heard CJ scream too, and all of the commotion, but was too scared to get out of the tent. She didn't even know he had left the tent until she had awoken to all the commotion. The woods at this time were silent, and we weren't sure what to do. Nathan argued in whispers that we need to go out and look for him to make sure he's okay. And I started arguing back saying, "Did you hear what we just heard? I'm not going out there with what we heard." That's when we started to hear noises in the brush nearby. Then we started to hear the growling. It was extremely low. I remember the bass to it. It was demonic, and not all the same energy like the bear brought earlier. This was different entirely. The bear that we were certain was in our camp before was sniffing around and probably just curious. We could tell it was a bear, just alone due to its huffing sounds and breaths, and the thuds on the ground. There was just certain sounds bears make. I mean, it was unmistakable. This, though, was different. The footsteps sounded incredibly heavy, but heavy in a different way. It sounded like it was walking on 2 legs, not 4 different legs, and it sounded slow, like this animal was trying to be sly. The growling and humming it emitted were so evil. I don't know how to relay the emotion. Nathan and I turned white. We knew we were in grave danger. Something else besides a bear was outside of our tent. I was frozen in fear, but I knew I had to do something. I didn't have any weapons on me or near me. I had a pocket knife in my backpack somewhere, but that wasn't going to help me at all in this situation. Nathan pulls out this police-like flashlight, which I didn't even know he had, out of his sleeping bag, and shines it outside the tent flap, looking around with a flashlight at whatever was around the camp. My heart dropped at his bravery, in fear of him invoking whatever animal is out there, and that we're in here. He didn't care. He wanted to try and scare this animal off. He moved the light just right, and at some point, fully illuminated, right by this tree, the ugliest wolf, if you want to call it that we have ever seen. It was looking down at the ground and slowly lifted its head up to meet its gaze with Nathan's beam of light. It let out a nasty growl. It was pissed. I started crying. The size of this thing's claws and teeth alone were enough to do it right in that moment. But its size alone, and the fact that I was looking at a werewolf standing 30 feet away from our tent, really drove it home. Nathan quickly turned the flashlight off and zipped up our tent as fast as he could and dove back into his sleeping bag. I've never seen him so pale in my life. I thought he was going to puke. I was on the verge of having a mental breakdown, knowing that we just saw what we did and it was real. Now I'm stuck in this tent. CJ is gone and poor Ashley is left all alone in the nearby tent, unsure of her safety. We have no weapons and there's a goddamn werewolf walking around our tents. But things quieted down. We didn't hear anything. Not even the thudding of this thing's footfalls walking around now. That made us even more nervous. What if it was sneaking around now? What if it was employing stealth to try and get us? We had to stay awake. We could not fall asleep in case this thing tried to get us. This was the worst passing of time I've ever experienced in my life. We were probably in that tent for hours upon hours, just lying awake, constantly on high alert and aware of our surroundings, but couldn't move. We finally started to see daylight at some point, but didn't want to risk getting out of the tent until we had more visible light. We were so exhausted from the sheer adrenaline rush and the intensive amount of fear. None of us had really slept at all. If at any point during this experience I still had alcohol in my system, it had scared me stone cold sober. I guess I should have checked my phone for the time, but I didn't. It was summer, so it gets bright early, like 5 a.m., so maybe it was between then and 6. Nathan finally signaled for us to get out of the tent and just leave our shit. We were going to grab our essentials, but fuck the tents and the beer. We didn't want anything to do with being out this far in close contact with that freak of nature, freak of a monster out here. Once it was light enough, we got out of the tent. We could see enough that our camp had been thoroughly rummaged through. Whether it had been done by the bear or whatever it was we saw, we weren't quite sure. We ran over to Ashley and CJ's tent, and Ashley had been curled up in the fetal position asleep. We woke her up and told her we needed to go find CJ and get out now. She had fallen asleep from pure exhaustion. I don't blame her. We started to head back towards the way we came. Luckily, I know we weren't far from the vehicle, so we headed back in that direction. Now, this is where shit got really real for us. We're running back with just our backpacks towards where we believe we parked on NF13. We're yelling for CJ, but nothing, of course. There was a bloody trail, and we couldn't make out what it was, but if I had to guess, it looked like an animal had been killed and then dragged. It was dragged in the direction where we were heading, so we walked back in the early morning. These drag marks went alongside of us. Up on this little hill as we got to the top, there it was. Well, what was left of it at least. A large, or when it was alive, black bear. Its body was bloody, mangled, and crushed to a pulp with its guts ripped out and strewn across the ground. It looked like this thing had been crushed by a boulder. Nathan and I were speechless when we came across it, and Ashley gasped. She started crying, saying she just wanted to go home. I knew in that moment if we didn't get back to the car now and escape, we were going to be killed. I don't know what the hell is out there in the woods that can take down an adult-sized black bear, but I didn't want to mess with it. I was filled with fear and adrenaline again, and at one point back to the car, the thought that CJ might have been killed and eaten haunted me. We never found him. We did eventually make it back to the car by the miracle of God himself. It was still early in the morning and no sign of CJ still. Now, we're standing by the car, arguing whether to leave and go find help, or to go back in the woods and look for CJ. Ashley is just crying hysterically, while me and Nathan are continuously arguing about what to do, when we see this lone car in the distance head our way. Then we see the lights, and immediately recognize that is a cop car. We turn and signal the car down, and the car stops in the road. The cop gets out and asks us if we were okay, and what was going on. We explain to the officer our story of what happened, and he tells us that CJ is in the hospital. He made a beeline for the road last night after being attacked by some unknown animal, suffered deep wounds in his back and left arm. Something attacked him, most likely a bear, the cop said, due to the claw size and the amount of sheer tissue damage and blood loss, but he almost bled out and was transported to the hospital. A different officer just happened to be driving by and found him waving on the road, bleeding like a stuck pig. This officer was sent here to come look for us. I guess CJ had mentioned he had 3 other friends, maybe a mile or 2 in the woods, that we needed help. The officer told us he would like to take our names and take our story down. He allowed us to drive to the hospital and meet up with CJ, and of course, he followed. We got to the hospital and CJ was sleeping, all bandaged up. The same officer really began asking questions, even though we told him exactly what happened. Even though CJ was all bloody, he began acting weird. I don't think he believed us. Turns out the PD actually thought we conspired to attack and kill CJ, and that the whole werewolf bear phenomena thing we experienced was just a clever cover-up to mask our failed attempt at murder. Things got a little crazy and we were brought in for questioning. Each of us, of course, but CJ's story once again had come to save us. He was able to tell that his story lined up with all of our other stories that we experienced. Detectives got to him before we did, so they were able to get his story first and foremost. He told them he had gotten up in the middle of the night to take a piss when he thought he heard a bear approaching. Then, he says he heard all of this crazy commotion, like 2 big animals fighting, and he fled off into the night, with only his phone light. Something ran after him. Something that looked like a wolf walking on 2 legs, and tried to grab him, but it didn't. It slashed his back and left arm pretty bad. He says the run from that to the road was a blur, and didn't even realize he was bleeding as much as he had. He literally had fat oozing out of his wounds, they were so deep. Absolute crazy shit that no one will ever tell you. So there it is, that's my story. I remember it vividly, like I said, and I'll carry it around with me forever, and I will never forget it. I still keep in contact with Nathan on Facebook and don't see much of CJ anymore. He took a coding job down in Western Virginia and obviously made a full recovery. I'll have to see if I can get him to send me a pic of his scars so I can show you. They're gnarly. Oh, and him and Ashley broke up a long time ago, so I haven't kept in contact with her in ages. But there you go. Believe it or not, I swear by the Bible and all that is holy that this is what happened to us, including the accusations that we somehow tried to murder CJ and that whole mess. I'm glad it's in my past where it thoroughly belongs.